All right, A Quiet Place Part 2 is directed by John Krasinski, and it stars Emily Blunt, Millicent Simmons, Killian Murphy, Noah Jupe, sort of John Krasinski, but not really. We'll certainly get more into that as we go. If you're not familiar with A Quiet Place Part 2, following the events at home in Part 1, the Abbott family now face the terrors of the outside world. Faced to venture into the unknown, they realize the creatures that hunt by sound are not the only threats lurking beyond the sand path. All right. Well, before we get into the film, as we noted in the intro, we do have a great guest joining us for this review. Joining us once again is the great Brad Hargis from the Cinema Guys podcast. Brad, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me back. I feel like I've been away forever.
Yeah. It's been a while.
I know, JD, you and I have seen each other recently. We got to hang out at the beginning of the year. But
this makes me feel like the odd man out.
I know. I've seen Brad recently that I've seen Brendan in person.
That's sad.
It's been so long since I've been able to see Brendan's lovely face. But yeah, I got to hang out with Brad, which was very exciting when he was down here in South Florida.
Nice.
But as we noted in the intro, Brad, the last time you were on was episode 337 for The Farewell.
yes.
So it's been a while. Yeah, it's been a while.
It has been a while. Which The Farewell is, I mean, that's a fantastic movie.
Yeah.
If you have not seen it.
Absolutely. Very much concur with that. But yeah, it's great to have you back. And for a very different film. Quiet Place Part 2.
Very different.
It's nothing like The Farewell. But let's go ahead and get into it. I'm very curious to hear what you guys think of it. The film doing very well at the box office, which is another conversation we could certainly have. But speaking to the film itself, Brad, what did you think about A Quiet Place Part 2?
Well, I was a huge fan of the first one. The first one just kind of, it was almost a perfect horror movie for me. It was full of atmosphere and played a lot on the sound and not being able to see the creature much. And then you get to Part 2, it's a little bit of a different, take on it. You get more creatures, more action, it's like more, but I still loved it. I thought it still hit, like it picks up basically right after the second one and you just go. And it, I didn't quite like it as much as the first one. It wasn't quite up there, but it was close. Like it was a really good sequel.
Okay. Yeah, and it's kind of impossible to talk about A Quiet Place Part 2 without at least acknowledging its predecessor. And that's not necessarily to compare quality, but it's mostly due to how these films operate alongside one another. And that's made clear by this newest installment that these are kind of meant to function more like chapters in a much grander story. So in some ways to call so in some ways to call this a horror sequel, I feel like that's almost a little disingenuous.
Very much so. Yeah.
These are all chapters, and I feel like that approach is going to continue with Part 3, and we may have some more thoughts about that as far as Jeff Nichols being the one to tap to direct that one.
Brendan saying my word.
Yeah, I know how much you love. I know how much
you
got
to be
Jeff
careful
Nichols.
when you say the name Jeff Nichols around me.
And I know, because all of a sudden you're going to start crying. I know how that works. Now, before I compare this new one to the first film as far as quality is concerned, I do want to reiterate what I thought about that first film. And I will say I do like it, but I don't love it. And while I didn't get the chance to revisit it before seeing Part 2, I do stand by really liking that first film as a family drama about a grieving family failing to make any rational sense of the new world around them. I just didn't think it really functioned as well as a horror film. It felt a little cheap and, ironically, too loud in its scare tactics. And A Quiet Place Part 2 was almost the exact opposite experience for me. I think its drama and themes are a bit more streamlined, not quite as dense as that first film, even though I do think it is getting into some really interesting ideas, which I'm sure we'll discuss during this review. But I do think this one is better as a horror film when compared to the first one. I think Krasinski as a director takes better advantage of silence to generate some real palpable tension, and I found his use of scare tactics here quite a bit more sophisticated this time around. And for these reasons, I actually do like A Quiet Place Part 2 a little bit more than the first one, and I do find myself kind of moved by the end regarding its notions on bravery and who in your family is the one to absorb the responsibility of protecting you all, and I find that really interesting. So, I guess take that with a bit of a grain of salt, because JD, you know that I'm a bit of a different kind of critic when it comes to horror films. I tend to look at things a little bit differently than some other people, so maybe that's why I'm responding to this one a little bit differently, but I really liked where this one was going.
Yeah, this should be an interesting conversation as always. I'm very much like Brad. I absolutely loved part one. I thought its use of sound was inventive. The camera work, I think, is quite underrated in terms of framing and structure. Krasinski did a lot with the camera that went under talked about.
Sure.
But more poignantly, its heart and soul lies with the film's ideas on grief, coping with tragedy, and moral ambiguity, with Evelyn and Lee bringing a baby into an apocalyptic world where sound is a death rattle. As it relates to parental responsibility, there is an argument to be made that by indulging in intimacy, which came as a result of attempting normalcy inside grief, they endanger not just themselves, but their two other children. The thematic complexities of the first film, I think, is quite fascinating and rich, in addition to it being an engrossing experience aesthetically.
Yeah, a lot of irrational decisions in that movie.
For sure. Part two builds off the momentum of part one impeccably for me. Aside from its prologue, as you guys noted earlier, it starts off in the immediate aftermath of part one, so there's not much time to linger in the victory they experienced at the end with Evelyn killing the creatures attacking their house. They pack up their things, set off a signal, and quietly walk to the next destination. In terms of structure and storytelling, I love that this is very much indeed a part two rather than a conventional sequel. Not that I'm against sequels per se,
right?
But as we noted on last week's show, this existing is a direct result of the first film doing so well at the box office. And instead of shoehorning in a narrative that feels uninspired and is only here to make even more money, the story here does have purpose, and it intentionally builds off characterization from the first one, particularly with Regan and Marcus, who are a heavy focus and, in the end, a mirroring of Evelyn and Lee's courage and relentlessness. This is a love letter to Krasinski's children, and by proxy, a love letter to any parent who loves their children as deeply as he does, which again is where it thrives for me in many respects. Objectively, I think this has more flaws than the first film, so I'm certainly on the opposite end of you, Brendan, when it comes to that.
Okay.
But aesthetically, Krasinski's direction is appropriately so, I think, very similar. The sound design is spectacular. The quiet airiness of this film is palpable. So when sound does come, it's often a visceral jolt. The camera work is also very good. Once again, Krasinski using certain angles or heights to build suspense and tension, which on its own is effective, but especially when coupled with the sound design. And I also love the production design and the practicality of it, especially that abandoned warehouse or manufacturing plant where much of this film takes place. Like part one, there is a lot to like about Krasinski's direction and how intense it is. But for me, it's how it builds emotionally, wrapping its arms around Regan and Marcus, and how tender that becomes in the final sequence. If we're separating them out, I slightly prefer the first film, like Brad, but as you noted, Brendan, that's arguably disingenuous. This is more so one experience split into two parts and eventually three parts. And as a singular experience, I think it's emotionally involving and quite daunting as a horror film.
And as a parent, like, you know, part one is basically the parents, what would you do to protect your family, your kids going forward? And then part two, these kids just lost a father. What are they going to do in this world to step up, to take the next step forward in what they need to do to move on?
And because of that, it's arguably more of a coming-of-age film when compared to the first one, and maybe that's another reason why I responded to part two a little bit more than part one, because, as we were talking about offline, I'm not a parent yet myself, so that sense of innocence is probably something I'm just more able to relate to at my stage in life. And kind of looking at it from that point of view, when you look at the character of Reagan, played so well by Millicent Simmons, and I think this might be her best performance as an actress at this point, and I've loved her in everything she's done, including Wonderstruck, the Todd Haynes film. She really is front and center here in a lot of ways, and this is really a story of her attempting to carry on her father's legacy and his bravery, and that is very interestingly juxtaposed by Marcus, played by Noah Jupe, who for most of this movie kind of lacks that bravery. He emulates a lot more fear throughout the film in ways that I think are a little bit I guess problematic in some of the writing. I don't know if I like everything that happens from a narrative standpoint involving him. I think that could have been tightened just a little bit, but I like the thematic intent. This is really a film about children learning to carry on their father's legacy by becoming the protectors of their family, and how that role is not always absorbed by the parent. And I found that notion very powerful.
I found it very powerful as well. A clear distinction and juxtaposition between the two that I think is handled very well from a thematic point of view. Now, I do agree with you about Marcus in terms of some of the plotting of the film. I do want to get into that because it's by far my biggest criticism of the film.
Sure.
But as far as this being a love letter to our children, I do think, again, at least on a thematic level and narratively with the Regan character, I think it works wonderfully. But the journey of those two overcoming their grief. And again, I love that this is a quick transition from the first film to the second one, right? Because their father at the very beginning of this film had recently just sacrificed himself. So they're still in shock in many regards and are now taking ownership and responsibility in this new environment that they find themselves in, which leads to an ending sequence that is so remarkably poignant. The editing of it is obviously calculated, but wonderfully astute, I think.
Oh man, that moment of triple tension where you got all of these ties coming together, it's so expertly crafted.
And while there is suspense and tension in the moment, given Krasinski's direction, the camera work, the score by Marco Beltrami, the cutting back and forth between Regan and Marcus, and how they simultaneously demonstrate this fearless moxie in order to protect the parental figures they are with, is incredible. The parallels of that in particular to their fatherly in part one is astounding, especially on a thematic and emotional level. I still think it mostly works in writing as well. And maybe I'm biased, but man, the poetic beauty of that and how this film ends left me floored.
Krasinski, I want to see more, not just a horror movie. I want to see him direct more stuff. Like between this and part two, I want to see him do just a hardened drama and just see what he can do
for sure
with characters.
And not even just that. And part of the reason why I think I like part two a little bit more than part one, as far as it being a thriller of sorts, is that part two is sort of obligated to be a bit of a louder movie because we are physically expanding on this world. We are going a little bit deeper, which lends itself to be a bit more vast and grand in that sense. And at times, this almost feels like it could be comparable to a Spielbergian action film. And I almost feel like Krasinski could handle action very well, too. He's actually showing a lot of range with this movie. Yeah. And when you compare that to the familial elements that we really responded to between this and even part one, it's so hard for a first-time director to have that type of balance and to make it seem so seamless without tripping over his ambitions that we see so many times with first-time directors. And in the case of part two, John Krasinski is also the sole screenwriter here. So this really is more of his baby than anything else. And I love the confidence in that. You don't see that often with first-time directors.
Which should make it interesting once Jeff Nichols gets into the fold. But I do agree with you. There is a seamlessness from part one to part two that is really great. And as you guys are talking about, this film does expand a little bit, given that they leave their home and they find themselves in new territory. But still inside everything that we see here, the film maintains a simplicity that I really liked.
Yes.
We get the prologue at the beginning of the film that introduces us to the Killian Murphy character and how he knew our central family before the world went to hell. So when he shows up again after Evelyn and the kids leave the house, there isn't any need for mundane exposition. They already know each other, and the film can move on organically.
In fact, Evelyn even recognizes him while his mask is still covering his face.
Exactly. And I think the dialogue between he and Evelyn is great. It's all about where they are emotionally and how they see the world at that given moment in time. We do learn a little bit about what happened to his family, but that information feels warranted as Evelyn and the kids wouldn't necessarily know it either. We simply learn along with them. And as the film goes from there, his arc is a matter of redemption and trying to feel hope again, which I think is emotionally complementary to our central family. But in terms of plotting and narrative, I love the simplicity of it because of Regan's ambition, again, marrying the courage of her father, which is a great through line in the film in terms of people seeing that in her. But because of her courage, she ends up separated from Evelyn and Marcus, which then leads to the Killian Murphy character following her. And I don't want to get into too many spoilers from there. I'll just vaguely say their journey, while it does expand from the first film in terms of world building, I guess, it's not all that complicated. There's a train involved, a boat, and a radio station.
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that.
In fact,
and even that sounds more involved than what it actually is in execution.
In fact, the IMDb plot synopsis that you read there is also very disingenuous because it seems to imply that there's this bigger threat involving bad people out there. And
yeah, exactly.
as I
was reading that, I was like, what? That's barely in this film.
It's in the film for maybe 2 minutes.
Maybe 2 minutes.
Not even that. It's just a small subset.
It's very, very small. And as for Evelyn and Marcus, they are almost exclusively at that manufacturing plant, with the exception of Evelyn leaving once to find medicine. And that's pretty much it. The drama of the film is pretty well contained. Perhaps some will find that rudimentary, but I love how non-convoluted it is because it leaves room for nuance when the film marinates in character motivation and the dynamic between every single one of them.
In the group of bad people, that was almost my least favorite scene because when it came up, I was like, oh, we're gonna do this. Don't do this. Don't. It's a trope.
It felt so Walking Dead. Like we've seen it in so many apocalyptic stories.
Yeah, I love that it's
and
brief.
I'm glad it was just a quick. We're in. Okay, we're out.
Exactly.
Like, thank goodness.
Yeah.
We didn't go on this too much.
And that complements the film's simplicity that you guys were talking about there, especially you, JD, because this could have easily been too grand, almost overly complicated because it's the nature of expanding on this world. And it doesn't overcomplicate things. In fact, the span of the movie is only, a couple of days, very similar to the first film. So in that sense, it almost feels like it has a looser structure when compared to the first film, and I kind of like that about it. In fact, it doesn't really have that much of a clear beginning, middle, and end because, like I said in my opening, this really isn't a sequel to a prior film. And with part 3, who knows if it's going to leave things open for a part 4 at some point, depending on how the box office fares for part 3. I have a hunch that because of how well this film has been received, both financially and critically at this point, that the world could even expand from that. So who knows? But this almost feels like a string of chapters or a string of like anthology films, all connecting short mini stories together about this one family in this post-apocalyptic world. And I love the simplicity of that.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. They could have easily gone, from this simple atmospheric movie to, all right, we're going full action. Here comes a bunch of monsters. Let's bring in a whole bunch of people in a big fight.
Yeah,
and
we do get some of that.
They didn't.
We do get some of that here, especially in that day one prologue, and a lot of that was in the trailer. But again, going back to Krasinski's direction, it is surprisingly well crafted, and some of the use of one takes there are very seamless. You don't really notice them right away, which is a sign of a good one take sequence.
And I mean, we've all seen that trailer with the bus, and still seeing it in the theater, I was still tense in that scene.
Yeah,
which they've noted the practicality of that. That Emily Blunt was in that vehicle. The bus was very real, driving at her at 40 miles an hour. And
wasn't she mad at her husband for that too?
Something like, or she was at least hesitant to do it. But they got it right, and it's visceral in context of the film for sure. And again, that's why I wanted to note Krasinski as a director, because I feel like so much of the discourse around this film and also part one is about the sound design. And that should be noted because it's so great in both of these films. But what he does with the camera is equally as impressive and
yeah,
should be
absolutely.
talked about as much. I love what he's doing with it in part one, but in this film as well.
Yeah.
Getting to one of the bigger criticisms of the film, because this is the difference for me in terms of liking this film, but not quite loving it as much as part one. And perhaps this is rooted in the film containing its drama, but I think some of Marcus's decision-making is awfully contrived in the third act, or as we near the third act, specifically after Evelyn leaves to find medicine. Him leaving the confines of where he's at, I'll just say, to do what I'm not even sure. Explore the facility at night makes no sense whatsoever.
He's going exploring. He's very curious, but there's nothing that provokes him to really do that.
And that's my problem. There's no reason for him to be doing what he's doing, especially when his responsibilities now involve the newborn child.
Yeah.
And the film had already established that the oxygen tank was low, putting the baby at risk further to enhance tension in that specific way, as far as Marcus leaving, just comes off as contrived. Not to mention the dangers of Marcus being exposed himself. And again, for what? Because he's bored? The film never really establishes motive there.
It also contradicts his arc as a character because, as I said earlier, the film is meant to juxtapose his arc when compared to Regan because he's the fearful one. He hasn't quite accepted that role as a brave protector in his family. So for him to go out there and explore like that is incredibly contradictory to what he would probably do in that moment.
Yeah, he would not leave. He would have just stayed there and who knows what.
Yeah. I get what the narrative is trying to do in terms of giving him redemption. So we need to demonstrate a moment of weakness, but to manufacture tension out of illogical decision-making was quite frustrating, especially because the film had foreshadowed the whole door towel thing enough that we knew something was coming down the pike. It
was the nail version in this movie versus how it was in the first movie.
And I had no problem with that drama when it comes. The tank was low on oxygen. The door could be a huge problem if not handled properly. The table was set for something harrowing to go down. And surely there was another way to find noise to set off those events in motion other than having Marcus do something that feels completely out of character, let alone being irrational. If it was Sam, if it was my son who's 5 years old, I could understand that more because 5-year-olds have no comprehension for logic. But Marcus is old enough to know better. And
he's also injured.
Exactly. The guy nearly lost his leg. He's barely wobbling around. And
especially going through, the first film, everything he went through in that to, basically it's kind of like he took a step back.
Yeah. And as we noted earlier, both of these films have demonstrated that he's way more of a nervous Nelly compared to his sister. And that makes for a better redemption arc, I think. Not him overcoming a dumb, untenable mistake, but rather pushing past his cowardice and embodying his father's heroism, his mother's courage. That's way more affecting than contriving, some sort of redemption because he made this horrible mistake.
Yeah, I agree with that too. And it's sort of a double-edged sword for me because from a filmmaking standpoint, I mentioned this earlier, it leads to this layering, this editing of 3 parallel stories of tension going on simultaneously, including that one of Marcus. And from a filmmaking standpoint, it's really effective. And like I said, it was very expertly crafted the way that Krasinski cuts between multiple threads. But getting to that point, at least from Marcus's side, a third of that, the arrival of that, that needed to be streamlined a bit. That needed to be thought out because it does go against that arc, as we've been saying.
I did want to go back to, you talked about we have the 3 story arcs going on, and you mentioned Beltrami doing the music. There is one scene in this movie that his music I absolutely loved. It's when Evelyn, Regan, and Marcus, they kind of all have their 3 separate stories, and the score is playing, but he's playing this piano like off tune.
Mm.
And to me, it was like the family's broken, the music's broken. You know, we're not together. Everything's off. And then if you notice later, it comes back to like the more tense, tight music when everything is starting to come back.
That's a great point. It's very dissonant during those moments. And when there is this epiphany of sorts, when we get to the film's climax, things become more melodic, more the major scales tend to come back into fold, and it actually starts recurring some of the themes from the first film. So it is very cleverly scored this time around. I don't know if this is an unpopular opinion, but I actually slightly preferred Marco Beltrami's work in this film versus part one, at least the way it's employed during some of those moments of tension that we do get, especially in the first half, because it does feel like to be a much quieter film to me. But some of those touches to really emulate the drama, I think, are very effective too.
Yeah, and I'm glad you guys bring that up, because as frustrated as I was with Marcus's decision making, how out of character that was, in terms of craft, once again, as the film edits back and forth between all three of those storylines, the music is great. I completely agree with you. I love what Beltrami's doing here with the score. But in terms of the precision of the editing, I think all of that is handled very well, on top of, again, the sound design, the camera work, and all of that. Even as Marcus is stumbling around the facility for God knows what reason, I still think there's tension there, manufactured and contrived as it may be. I still think Krasinski handles it well enough from a direction standpoint that the tension is still palpable enough. And I really liked what I was seeing with Evelyn in terms of her going out to get medicine and then coming back. She has a moment there with one of the creatures that is quite visceral as well. And then everything we see with Regan and the Killian Murphy character. I love all of that. I think the way it's structured, it's almost like a dance in many respects, right? Because it's 4 or 5 minutes. We're constantly editing back and forth. The music is doing its thing. And it feels like a horror ballet in many regards.
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get to final thoughts. We'll go back to you, Brad. Do you have any concluding thoughts here on A Quiet Place Part 2?
I can't wait to watch these movies back to back, because they play so well, I believe, as just one full story. That I watched the first one earlier in the week and then went to see the second one, and I'm like, it's just one full story. I want to see it immediately to kind of see if there's any different jumps in the characters as we go to part 2 onto part 3, which I cannot wait to I want this story to continue. I want to see what this family has next.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sort of with you on that too, primarily due to the fact that part 3 is being directed by Jeff Nichols. And I mean, on paper, I am a little concerned about that, because I like when filmmakers like a Jeff Nichols can stick within their indie wheelhouse, if that makes sense. But A Quiet Place feels more like a franchise that has this sense of sophistication and honoring directors' visions than maybe other big franchises do. So it makes me a bit more hopeful that when we get to part 3, we're still going to get a Jeff Nichols film and not a franchise film that just happens to be directed by Jeff Nichols. And that's a big difference. And I feel like with the way that this is going, we're most likely going to get the former there. And that's pretty exciting, especially if Michael Shannon ends up showing up somewhere. And I know he probably will. But Jeff Nichols is someone that is very good at creating silent drama just by visual expressions, as you know, JD, in a movie like Midnight Special as a great example of that. And John Krasinski has shown that this franchise is all about that so far. And one of my favorite things that I didn't even mention yet was Killian Murphy's performance as Emmett. His arc here is, for the most part, at first, sort of the antithesis to Lee from the first film, or at least Regan kind of sees him that way. She sees him as this coward, and that makes a lot of psychological sense. She just came off the heels of witnessing her father sacrifice himself for them, so naturally, someone like Emmett and his regressive tendencies, she's going to point the finger at him for that. And Emmett has to sort of relish in that, and you can tell he's having a hard time trying to come to terms with that. And that's what I really like about Cillian Murphy's performance. And it's a very silent performance for the most part, too. I think it's very effective. So I am excited to see where this goes. I don't love everything about these two films thus far, but because of the way that it generates tension, I do still slightly prefer part 2 over part 1. But kind of hard to say that as a genuine feeling when in actuality what we're really getting is one complete story in just separated parts.
Absolutely.
I was like, they can't all be, a Snyder cut in 4 hours and 2 minutes.
Exactly.
We've talked about Zack Snyder negatively on this show too many times. We can't get back down that rabbit hole.
I know, and people have been harping on us for it, so we'll
go to iTunes and you'll see why.
But yeah, I do agree with a lot of what you guys are saying. And I do want to bounce off of your conversation there, Brennan, about Cillian Murphy, because we haven't talked about him specifically. We mentioned that he's in the prologue, and I do like the writing of Emmett in regards to how he fits in with the Abbott family. But in terms of his performance, it is very subtle. I love how understated it is, very appropriate to really everything else that we've seen in both of these films. And I mentioned that there is an element of redemption with his character. And I love, again, the simplicity of it. I love that we're not spending a bunch of time, relishing in melodrama when it comes to that character, because it's all in his performance. We hear what happens, and then Murphy gives us everything that we need to know afterwards. And because of the separation factor in terms of Regan, again, channeling her father's courage and wanting to do more, a through line that I really do love, that of course involves Emmett, and how that relates back to his redemption, I think is handled very well without, and this is important, I think without ever undermining Regan's arc in it as well. Like, he never takes over. It is still always about Regan, but he's there enough that his arc, that redemption, is ultimately effective, especially because of how this film ends in a way where Evelyn and Emmett, again, the parental figures, are a little bit more vulnerable than Regan and Marcus. And so they take on the responsibility in a way that parallels a lot of what we see with Lee at the end of part 1. And it's handled so poetically, as we talked about earlier. I really do love that. But Cillian Murphy, very good in this film.
Yeah.
Now, as it relates to Jeff Nichols going forward into part 3, I think it's an impeccable choice. I think he fits this world perfectly, especially when you consider not just Midnight Special, but also Take Shelter. And Take Shelter, in many regards, is a horror film. It's not labeled a horror film, but aesthetically, tonally, it certainly fits the bill in many regards.
I feel like, if anything, that's the film that probably got him the gig to do part 3.
And I think it's great because A Quiet Place, in terms of Krasinski's vision for these films, and going back to something you said earlier, Brad, in terms of wanting to see Krasinski do a straight-up drama, because as a drama, I do think these films are very effective.
Oh, yeah.
They're emotional. The familial complexities of these two films, I think, is really great. And that's something Jeff Nichols is very good at as well. And in terms of, these films being horror-ish, there's a lot about it that is unconventional in terms of, again, sound, the premise of this film, how Krasinski toys with that. And for me, in terms of tone, in terms of vibe, it just feels like Take Shelter would translate immaculately to that.
Yeah, I can see that.
Now, we've never really seen Jeff Nichols go full on horror as these films do at times. But I think the tone of Take Shelter, especially in its third act, comes awfully close to the tone and the style that Krasinski is going for, because Krasinski, while he does have his craft, he has his tricks, he's never losing sight of the emotion and the characters and, the family dynamic, right? And that is Nichols through and through.
Yeah. And also in the film's setting, like the fact that Nichols is someone that loves spending most of his time in rural America specifically,
Yeah.
and you sort of get that same rustic quality here in both A Quiet Place films.
Yeah, exactly.
And in the way that you have children more front and center in part 2, I was also thinking quite heavily of Jeff Nichols' film Mud with Matthew McConaughey and Ty
Very
Sheridan.
rustic and gritty.
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah, and I could certainly see why someone like Jeff Nichols would be tapped to explore this franchise a little bit further.
And if part 3 does expand even further, Midnight Special, I think, is a film that demonstrates his ability to tell a gripping story that involves, characters finding themselves vulnerable, but there's a larger narrative in that film anyway, in terms of the government trying to find the kid and, the world somewhat expanding from the singular focus of the family.
Sure.
If part 3 goes down that territory in some regards, I think Midnight Special has demonstrated he can do that. So I think he's a perfect choice. As soon as I heard the name, I was like, yeah, of course. Who else would do it? If it's not Krasinski, of course it's Jeff Nichols. That makes so much sense to me. So, yeah. And, we haven't seen Nichols in a while. So please, whatever it is, I just want more of him.
And I just want it to be a Jeff Nichols film. Ideally, I would like to have seen him make another film yet again before making part 3 in this franchise. But this franchise, as I said earlier, is about, at least it feels like it's about honoring the visions of directors. It's not like other superhero genres or other superhero films specifically. Now, if Jeff Nichols was making a superhero film, I'd be very concerned for the longevity of his career. But in this case, I feel like he could still be making a Jeff Nichols film, and one that exists as a Quiet Place film, but also as a Jeff Nichols film in his own filmography, and that's a great step.
Let me be very clear on this. I want to be super crystal clear. Jeff Nichols has already made a superhero film.
I mean,
it is called Midnight Special, and people need to go see it. It is a masterpiece.
JD, are you crying already?
Seen it, so I will put it on my list.
Wow.
But I'm not
Brad.
kidding. It is a superhero film. Just go watch it. It'll make a lot of sense.
Okay. I just hope in part 3 that the studio doesn't start seeing the money flashing in front of their eyes, and they're like, okay, we need to open it up. We need more monsters. We need more this. We need more of that, and like keep it simple as it is right now.
Well,
Keep it quiet.
Here's two things.
Exactly.
Here's 2 things I'll say in response to that. One, this film demonstrated that they're willing to still keep it maintained, because the first film did very well financially.
That's
and
fair.
they still let Krasinski make his movie. And this is still very much contained. We talked about the simplicity of the narrative. It's his movie for sure. The other thing to that, if they want to expand and do things more conventional, they have hired the wrong guy, because that is not Jeff Nichols. I'm sorry. They've already made a huge mistake. So if you're hiring Jeff Nichols, you're basically saying, yeah, we want you to basically do the same thing again, but maybe with Nichols' flavor a little bit. But he's so comparative to Krasinski in many ways that, like I said, I think he'll fit in perfectly. So
I hope so.
And I also think it's interesting as well, given where this film ends. And I love the ambiguity of it. Like, the film in many ways ends abruptly, right? It's more about its poetic beauty and the emotion of it. In terms of drama and narrative, there are a lot of question marks at the end of this movie as to, so where do they go from here?
Oh, absolutely. And and to Brendan's point about being chapters, I mean, the first one ended the same way. It's just like, all right, we killed one, it's over.
Yeah.
So, and then we're on to the next one.
And the ending of this one sort of helps justify the way that the first film ended, because admittedly, I didn't really like the way the first film ended. I felt like it was a bit tonally, a bit too, I guess too cool, if that makes any sense, too full of itself. But the abrupt nature of it kind of makes sense, given that this is meant to be abrupt shifts in narrative between these different chapters. And it sort of helps justify the way that film ends.
Yeah, I agree. I certainly did not share that criticism, but I do think the beginning of this film does justify where part 1 does end.
Perhaps,
and tonally, narratively, emotionally, soon after that moment with Evelyn at the end of part 1, we're right back to being super vulnerable.
Yeah.
And, and things are very tender from there. So yeah, I really love this film and how there are brief moments of tension and action, but again, I cannot emphasize how brief it is. It is still all about character. It's about these characters channeling something inside of them, especially the kids channeling their fathers, the courage and sacrifice that they had seen from them. And then where that goes in the end is it's really great. Yeah. I really like it a lot. This is the kind of horror that I absolutely adore. So with that said, we have a full written review of this that you can see right now at InSessionFilm.com. I will, of course, have thoughts at Letterboxd. If you want to continue this conversation, hit us up there at letterboxd.com/InSessionFilm.
And if you agree or disagree with what we all just had to say about A Quiet Place Part 2, you can let us know by leaving a comment on our Facebook page at facebook.com/InSessionFilm. You can also tweet us directly at InSessionFilm or respond to us on Instagram. Our handle there is also at InSessionFilm. Or you can email us your thoughts in long form at InSessionFilm@gmail.com.
All right. Well, before we go, Brad, thanks so much for joining us, man. It was a pleasure to have you back on the show.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back. I enjoy it.
Yeah. Tell us real fast about the Cinema Guys. Where can we find you guys on the internet?
Well, the Cinema Guys, we are just three friends that just love to chat movies. It is myself, my co-host Justin, and the Cinemaiden, and we just have fun with it. We're not serious about it. We're just like, three friends chatting around a table.
Yeah.
And we can be found at wearethecinemaguys.com. It's the simplest place to find us.
Yeah, please go and give them a follow. Check out the show. Really great stuff. Really appreciate you, Brad, being here once again.
Thank you.
For the entire version of our podcast, be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes or on Stitcher, or check us out online at InSessionFilm.com.